Moving on to jurisprudence, and then we'll kind of talk about classifications of laws in this section. So, jurisprudence, we get what are the things that laws are based on, and they got pretty good examples of these in the book. I won't spend a lot of time, but natural law, just basically saying that there are things from nature that should help determine anyhow what our laws ought to be. Positive law is saying that society ought to take a look at what are the commands of the state, and then try to enforce those. That law should come from the state and then be enforced and based on, I guess whatever the state thinks is appropriate. Historical school says that we ought to go back and examine those laws which have stood the test of time, and maybe enact those laws that are good and that work and that we ought to keep those. Sociological says that law ought to be a force of good, that we should change laws based on current circumstances, and that it ought to be a force of good. The argument probably for Obamacare would be a sociological one, and traditionally the U.S. has been a free market, right? But we would be taking a good portion with Obamacare, we did take a good portion of our free market and turn it over to the government, presumably for good, right? And then legal realism is what's really enforced and what isn't. I think it gives you an example of speed limits, but another one might be marijuana, right? Marijuana is still illegal in the United States, everywhere in the United States, because it's considered a drug by the U.S. government, but the federal government, and especially under Obama, chose not to enforce that. They publicly announced that they were not going to enforce that. That may change. Jeff Sessions, our new Attorney General, has made insinuations that he may start enforcing that. So, but the legal realism says that even though it's illegal in the United States, some states have said that it is legal, and the federal government has not enforced their part of that law. So we've got classifications of law, civil law, and I put statutory law there because that makes more sense to me, I guess, and a little less confusing than when we get to the civil law that we talk about later. So civil law or statutory law means law that comes from lawmakers, from legislative actions, Congress, state legislatures, even local city councils, etc. Okay. Common law then is case law, okay, meaning that it's laws that have been developed over the years through decisions made by courts, right, or by judges, and we tend to be a little bit more of a common law. Granted, okay, we have lots of statutory laws, right? We have lots of laws that are made by Congress and states and localities, but in the U.S. those are all subject to review. Every one of them is subject to review. Doesn't mean they all do get reviewed, but they're subject to review, okay, by our judiciary. So that's what separates, I guess, or makes U.S. a common law nation. Public law versus private law. Public law is between people or entities, corporations, people, etc. Okay, lawsuits, those types of things. Private law, I'm sorry, I said that wrong. That's private law. Public law is when a governmental entity gets involved. Okay, and in the PB&J example, right, seemingly private, two brothers, right, but there was arrest made. And so then somebody violated the rules of the state, and the state then stepped in to enforce it, which made that public law. It could be both. Brother 1 might sue Brother 2, and that's a private law incident, but Brother 1 or Brother 2 maybe got arrested, and that's a public law incident. Okay, and we see that. We've seen that in some very famous cases. The original O.J. Simpson murder case was a good example of that. Okay, publicly he was acquitted or found not guilty, but privately he was sued and found to have committed a wrongful death and had to pay a large settlement as a result of that, or I guess he didn't actually end up paying it, but he is required still to pay a large settlement. Okay? Then we have civil law versus criminal law. And civil law, again, it's kind of, I got these two. Most public law or most criminal law, virtually all criminal law is public law, right? And civil law is pretty much private law. So civil law are those laws, again, to enforce contracts, to tort is an example. Criminal law, on the other hand, is when we've broken a rule of society. When we speed, when we get pulled over, that's technically a criminal law. Okay. There is some civil law that is public law, and that gets into agency laws and whatnot, and what they do to enforce standards, those types of things, which can be considered a civil law. Okay, so not all public law is criminal law, but all criminal law is public law. Okay, and not all civil law is private law, but substantive law are those laws that, again, speeding. The procedural laws are the things that, if you get picked up for a speeding ticket, then how do you solve that, right? Do you have to go to court? Can you just basically, most places, if it's a speeding ticket, they'll allow you basically to plead guilty on the spot and write them a check, right? Or send a check in and don't even go to court. But otherwise, you'd have the procedures. If it were a little more outrageous offense, you'd have the procedures that you would go through. You'd hearings, and complaints, answers, those types of things that we'll talk about. Oh, and I kind of got ahead of myself a little bit. So I've basically already kind of discussed these, so I'll kind of move on. Nations that are basically common law types of nations and why. And I think a lot of you guys in your assignment will put or did put that, our law is based on the laws that came from the United Kingdom. And that's mainly why we are a common law nation. And civil law, other parts of Europe and those places are a little more statutory, right, versus having that the judicial oversight. And again, it doesn't mean that they don't have juries or they don't have judges, they don't have a judiciary, but in that case, the judiciary makes decisions based on what the legislature said. In our case, the judiciary can actually void what the legislature has said. Public law, private law, again, I kind of got ahead of myself a little bit there. And civil law and criminal law. So civil law has kind of those two meanings, right? It's both statutory law and also law dealing with private rights of people. No punishment, I kind of consider that a bit of a misnomer under civil law because there can be punitive damages, right? Those are damages that go above and beyond compensatory damages. They intend to punish the wrongdoer in that case, and so there is punishment. I think what they're talking about is no physical punishment. In civil law, we don't throw people in jail. Okay, we don't do those types of things. They can be fined, right, which can be, I would think, a type of punishment, but in substantive versus procedural, again, things that I've already kind of discussed. So new cyber law, man, yeah, this is when our founders created the Constitution, and that's kind of why some people would say our Constitution needs to be a living document, because obviously a lot of the things that were around when our Constitution was set up, have changed. Today we have so many different things than what our founding fathers had. And how do you use a 250-year-old document to regulate and control those types of things, right? So people that create software, is that a property? Certainly. They have some property rights in that, right? Are binding agreements available or usable? And that's becoming more and more common, right? Electronic signatures. Okay. Can employers monitor email? Absolutely, and in fact, they have an obligation to. How's that? Your employer has an obligation to maintain email records. Rights to copies of intellectual property. Wow. Well, maybe Certainly, if you're the creator, you have rights to copies of those. What about other people, and how much can they be restricted? Employers and employee discipline, again, in relationship to using the internet and whatnot, it's become so pervasive in our society that what's right and what's wrong, and then regulation of the internet itself, and there's a huge push, and now I can't remember the name of it. On internet, it has to do with some companies might reduce Netflix's ability to stream, the ISPs or whatever that provide that, and because they take up so much bandwidth, right, and they may not be paying their fair share, and so there's huge discussions over that right now. It has to do with the FCC, I believe, or the Federal Communications Commission that deals with that. And then how does it affect interstate commerce? Taxation and those types of issues come into play there. Should an ISP be liable? So if you're maybe you're getting kiddie porn, right? Well, should your ISP or internet service provider, should they have an obligation to monitor what you're doing and expose the fact that you're getting kiddie porn or whatever? These are difficult things. So we'll break there.